It's like looking at an Impressionist painting, except there's nothing to see. Or it's like listening to French poetry, only there are no words. That is the unique pleasure of the music of Claude Debussy, a composer who blended all the art forms of the late 19th century into his own field of expression, music. His specialty was in painting colorful images with notes and telling lyrical stories with chords. What Monet and Renoir created on canvas and what Paul Verlaine created on paper, Debussy created with an orchestra. He founded what became known as musical impressionism, a new style that was one of the most important influences on 20th century music and composers. Debussy was an inventor and a rebel. Like many great artists, he was a man who liked to break the rules, both in his work and in his personal life. He was born on August 22, 1862, in the small town of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, not far from Paris. He used his full name, Achille Claude Debussy, until he was about 30, because he thought it sounded more elegant. He also spelled his last name in 2 words, Debussy, because he thought people might believe he was a member of the nobility. He dropped that pretension when he was still young, but there would be other pretensions later. Debussy was always somewhat of a dandy. The spelling of his name aside, there was nothing in Debussy's background to even suggest nobility. His family had been farmers and merchants for many generations, and his own father was the owner of a china shop. The Debussys had 5 children. Claude was the oldest, and the china shop was never very successful, so the family was often strapped for money. They moved a few times in search of better luck and finally settled in Paris, where the family split up. The other children went to live with an aunt, and Claude stayed with his mother, who was devoted to him. She taught him some reading and writing, but he was never a strong student, and even as an adult was notorious for his bad spelling. One of Debussy's sisters said he was a lonely and quiet child who spent a lot of time by himself. She said he would spend whole days sitting on a chair, thinking, no one knew of what. He had a particular fascination for small objects and miniatures and would study little paintings and ornaments for hours. When he was 7, Debussy visited an aunt who decided he should learn the piano. From that moment on, any hope he had of conventional formal education was lost. His father decided instead that Debussy would become a prodigy, like Mozart had been. The first piano lessons were paid for by his aunt's lover, who happened to be Claude's godfather. But when the love affair went bad, Claude had to find financial backing somewhere else. Luckily, he'd attracted the eye of Madame Motet de Florville, a woman who had been a student of Chopin's and who was mother-in-law to the famous French poet Paul Verlaine, who had become Debussy's favorite writer. Madame gave Debussy lessons for 3 years at no cost, and by the end of that time, he was skilled enough to win admission to the Paris Conservatory of Music. His father was now quite sure that Claude would be a great concert pianist, even though Claude himself couldn't have been less interested in such a career. Debussy was only 11 years old when he started at the conservatory, and he would stay there exactly 11 more. His piano teacher wrote, "He doesn't like the piano a great deal, but he does like music." Sometimes Claude was an obedient student. Sometimes he was a troublemaker. He had a habit of writing compositions that violated the rules of musical grammar, prompting one teacher to comment, "Everything he does is wrong, but he is wrong in a talented way." As a pianist, he had a style all his own, brilliant but wild and aggressive, impulsive and rough. One fellow student said Debussy literally charged at a piano as if he were enraged by it. Gradually, his interest in playing music gave way completely to a passion for composing it. When he was 17, Debussy took a break from his studies at the conservatory for a trip to Moscow. He'd been invited there by yet another wealthy woman patron, this time Nadezhda von Meck, the same woman who'd supported Tchaikovsky for so many years on the condition they never meet. Debussy met Madame von Meck when one of his teachers recommended him as a tutor for the family. He played duets with her children and served in the general role as family music advisor. In Moscow, Debussy came under the influence of the music of Tchaikovsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, and of the oriental sounds that often penetrated Russian music. Madame von Meck sent Tchaikovsky one of Debussy's compositions, and the response from the famous composer was that the work had some merit, but its themes were not fully developed. Madame von Meck also took Debussy to Switzerland and to Venice, where he met Richard Wagner and became entranced by Wagner's opera Tristan and Isolde. After these exotic escapades, it was back to the conservatory in Paris, where he tried to prepare himself for the musical competition for the Prix de Rome, a prize given each year to one student of composition at the conservatory. The judges had a hard time with Debussy's compositions. He had departed from convention, and they'd found dozens of mistakes when examining his harmonies. Far from discouraging Debussy, this news delighted him. Finally, he said, I have written something original. He may have achieved originality, but not surprisingly, he failed to qualify for the Prix de Rome. When he was 19, Debussy fell in love with Blanche Vaznier, the young wife of a Parisian architect who was part of the bohemian circle he was now hanging out with. She was a beautiful woman and also a talented soprano. Debussy left his family home so he could take up residence closer to the Vazniers and pursue his youthful romance. A few years later, at age 22, he tried again for the Prix de Rome and won with his cantata L'Enfant Prodigue, or The Prodigal Child. As part of his prize, he went to Rome to spend a few years in the luxurious Villa Medici, a Renaissance palace where artists could supposedly study and compose under ideal conditions. Unfortunately, like many composers, Debussy found the villa stifling. He didn't like Italy, he didn't like Italians, and he said being at the villa was like being in prison. Finally, he fled for home. Back in Paris, he wrote his third Le Printemps, which means spring. It was inspired by Botticelli's famous painting, also named Spring. Printemps shocked his contemporaries because it was written in the forbidden key of F sharp. The Vazniers persuaded Debussy to return to Rome and give it another year, which he finally agreed to do. But the whole time he was there, he was counting the days until the year was up, saying, "If I stayed, I should completely cease to exist. Since I have been in Rome, my mind has been dead." He may have felt his mind was dead, but in the 2 years in Rome, Debussy wrote several songs and a piece called La Demoiselle Élue, which was based on a poem by Rossetti. He also had the chance to meet other famous composers of the time. He visited Giuseppe Verdi at his country estate, but was disappointed when Verdi wanted to talk more about gardening than music. He met Franz Liszt, whom he found very friendly and encouraging. And when his year was up, he visited Johann Brahms in Vienna. Brahms took Debussy on a pilgrimage to the graves of Beethoven and Schubert, and then sent him back to Paris with best wishes for success. Debussy was now 25, and he had corresponded with Tchaikovsky, met Wagner, Verdi, Liszt, and Brahms, and paid homage to Beethoven and Schubert. It seemed almost mandatory that he now achieve something great. Debussy was at the beginning of his most productive period by the 1870s, and his reputation was widespread in Paris and in other parts of France and Italy. He wore his dark hair shaggy with full bangs. He had a thin mustache and a sparse short beard. His manner was so relaxed and languid that people used to compare him to a cat. He had a temper, but he followed up his outbursts by wheedling and cajoling people back into favor. He was somewhat cold and intellectual, just as his music has often been described. He also lived a life of extreme self-indulgence and had a series of affairs with different women, some of them of doubtful reputation. Debussy didn't associate much with other musicians. He preferred instead the company of poets and painters, the people who inspired his music. They often gathered at the home of French poet Stéphane Mallarmé, whose poem Afternoon of the Faun had inspired Debussy's orchestral work of the same name. Debussy's inspiration throughout his life came almost always from either literature or art. In fact, he once stated, "I love painting almost as much as music itself." When Debussy returned to Paris, he broke off with the Vazniers and took a mistress named Gabrielle Dupont, who was so jealous people called her Gabby of the Green Eyes. Their relationship was plagued by her threats of suicide and his admission that he too often thought of killing himself. Around this time, he made another visit to Richard Wagner, but came back disenchanted this time by Wagner's arrogance. He later described Wagner's music as goose-stepping, iron-helmeted music, the fortissimo chords of the trumpets, the beast-like cries, the inhuman grandiloquence, the bluster and blare which constantly shout, "I am the greatest of composers." At 28, he wrote one of his most popular pieces, Clair de Lune, a piece that couldn't have been more different from Wagner's popular style. It was part of a larger work called The Sweet Bergamask. He also struggled to create a full opera that would offer an alternative to the grandiloquence of Wagner, but he wasn't able to complete it. Instead, he produced one smaller opera called Peleus and Melisande, which became one of his most important and popular works, and Prélude de l'après-midi de Faune, Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun. In his mid-30s, Debussy married a seamstress named Rosalie Tessier, whom he called Lily. She was tall, blonde, and ethereal, not unlike the heroine Melisande in the composition he was finishing, but the composition was still in the works when the marriage had played itself out. Only a few years later, Debussy had an affair with Madame Emma Bardac, the wife of a prominent financier. She was also the mother of one of Debussy's children, and she was a singer who often sang his compositions for him. Debussy's friends were shocked by his affair. They felt sorry for the poor jilted Lily and mistrusted Debussy's claim that he'd been unhappy in his marriage all along. What followed was something of a soap opera. Lily shot herself but survived. While she was recovering from her wound, Debussy ran off with Emma. Emma and Debussy had a child whom they named Claude Emma, and finally Emma's husband agreed to a divorce. Debussy and Emma then married, but not after scandalizing all of Paris. To avoid the gossip, they fled to England for a while, where they stayed in the southern coast town of Eastbourne. Their daughter, Claude Emma, is the one Debussy dedicated his composition Children's Corner to, under his nickname for her, Chouchou. To my dear little Chouchou, with her father's affectionate apologies for what follows. What followed, in spite of his warning, was enchanting. The songs of the Children's Corner show an acute sensitivity and insight into a child's mind. Debussy finally released his opera, Peleus and Melisande, to the public, but it was plagued by opposition from the start. Maurice Maeterlinck, who had written the play it was based on, was miffed that his wife hadn't been selected to sing the title role. Not only had his wife been overlooked, but the woman chosen for the lead was an American of all things. Maeterlinck circulated hostile pamphlets to the cast at the first rehearsal and publicly stated that he hoped the show would be an immediate and emphatic failure. The show was a failure, but it also was a success. The first night, the audience hissed at it, so taken aback were they by the new sound and the lack of arias, melodies for a single voice. But then the piece became an object of curiosity, and other musicians began to imitate Debussy's style. Debussy was delighted. He always enjoyed flattery and adulation. By the time he was in his early 40s, Debussy had grown a fuller beard and become a little fat. He was sensual, loved pleasure, and admitted to being something of a hedonist. Now he often traveled to foreign cities, including London, to conduct his compositions. After Peleus and Melisande, Debussy decided to write more operas, grander ones with more range and scope. But first, he had to choose a story. He considered Shakespeare's As You Like It and King Lear, and Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher and The Devil in the Belfry. Poe was popular in France, more popular than he was in America, which was slower to recognize his genius. Debussy seemed to favor the idea of The Fall of the House of Usher the most, maybe because its hero, Roderick Usher, was a poet, a painter, and a musician. Debussy actually signed a contract for an opera on Poe's work with the Metropolitan Opera in New York City, but for some reason his plans to write it never materialized. Instead, he wrote his famous piece, La Mer, or The Sea. Debussy ventured into a new related line of work in his 40s when he became a music critic for several periodicals. His reviews were cranky and sarcastic for the most part, although witty and funny as well. He compared one piece of music to the smell of the chest of drawers of a nice provincial old maid. Of Wagner, he said, had he been a little more human, he would have been divine. After his death, the reviews were all published in an anthology called Monsieur Crush, Anti-Dilettante. Monsieur Crush was an alter ego, sort of an invisible playmate for an adult that Debussy created in the latter part of his life. He would have imaginary discussions with Monsieur Crush about the nature of music and art. For instance, Monsieur Crush once asked Debussy, "What is the use of your almost incomprehensible art? Is it not more profitable to see the sun rise than to listen to the Pastoral Symphony of Beethoven?" The next famous work Debussy produced was Iberia, his first composition that was received enthusiastically by public and critics alike. People felt it captured the spirit of Spain more than most Spanish music, although Debussy himself had never been to Spain. Then, when he was 52, Debussy wrote 2 sets of preludes and his 12 brilliant etudes. The following year, at age 53, the world plunged into World War I, and Debussy plunged into despair. Debussy was so distracted and depressed by the World War that he found it almost impossible to work. He wrote a few pieces that he intended as direct protests against military Germany, saying he was trying to react by creating a little of the beauty against which the enemy rages. He proudly signed his work Claude Debussy, Musicien Français, or French musician. Soon, the psychic suffering he was experiencing was matched by great physical suffering. Around 1916, he stopped writing altogether, and friends began to notice how thin and pale he'd become. Although he tried to hide it at first, Debussy had come down with cancer about 6 years before, when he was 48. Now he was in a steady decline. When the Germans started bombarding Paris with artillery, he was too weak to even make it to the cellar. Then, when the cancer progressed to the rectum, doctors operated in a last-ditch effort to save his life. He never recovered, and died on March 25, 1918, as the artillery was at its most furious and thunderous climax. He was 56 years old. Debussy was buried as exploding shells still rumbled in the distance, and as friends, some in uniform, said their final prayers. Debussy had lived his life at a pivotal time. Towards the end of the 19th century, there was a new artistic climate in Paris, more creative, more innovative, and challenging to the past. Debussy came along just as this movement, which had been reflected in Impressionist painting and poetry, was reaching its peak. Like the painters and poets had, he defied all convention, stating, "There is no theory. You have only to listen. Pleasure is the law." Debussy's music was a reaction to the popular music of the day that he considered overly ornamental and inflated. Along with other composers, he tried to free music from its sentimentality and from the nationalistic elements that people like Wagner had introduced. In response, he pioneered a sound that was pure, delicate, and more subtle. He set music on a path that was less grand and complex and more filmy and light. Like Impressionist paintings and poetry, his music was understated, not overstated. Because of Debussy and the composers he influenced, the center of music shifted from Germany to France. Many of Debussy's compositions, like his piano preludes, are miniatures, just like the tiny portraits and ornaments he liked to stare at as a child. Lots of them have descriptive, fanciful names such as What the West Wind Saw or Sounds and Scents Revolve in the Evening Air. One of Debussy's earliest works is also his best known, Clair de Lune, or Moonlight, which he wrote as part of the Suite Bergamasque when he was 28. In these pieces, which were written for piano, Debussy created a new blurry style, similar to Impressionist paintings. It's a style that perfectly evoked the translucence of moonlight. The title of Clair de Lune was taken from a folk song that was often used to accompany scenes of the lovesick Pierrot in French pantomime. The prelude of The Afternoon of the Faun was written in 1892 when Debussy was 30. It was an accurate title at first. Debussy intended it to be a prelude that would be followed by an interlude and then a summary. But the prelude seemed so complete in itself that he never bothered to write the remaining two parts. The orchestration of the prelude was creative and original. Debussy went as far in the opposite direction of Wagner as he could. Instead of a massive unity of sound, he emphasized every individual instrument, even starting out with a flute solo. This caused something of a stir at the time because flutes were then considered supporting instruments. But Debussy liked to create a stir. It's what made him feel like he was accomplishing something. The pure color of his sounds and the way he juxtaposed tones against other tones in the Afternoon of the Faun is what made critics compare Debussy's music to painting. From this point on, he was known as a musical impressionist. Debussy was 31 when he started Peleus and Melisande, a project that took 2 years to complete. He then refined it for 7 more years, and it wasn't performed for the first time until he was 40. It was based on a play, and Debussy's challenge from the start was to capture the emotion of the story. He said he was looking for music that seemed to have issued from a shadowy background and should, at moments, return there. When it was first presented, it caused a scandal. One of the gentler reviews called it a deadly bore. Yet, Peleus and Melisande is considered today to be the birth of modern opera. The Children's Corner was a group of piano pieces dedicated to his daughter Shushu, who was then 4 years old. As one can tell just from the names of the pieces, Debussy seemed to have great fun in creating them. The titles include Jimbo's Lullaby, Serenade for the Doll, and Snow is Dancing. Jimbo referred to a toy elephant that belonged to Shushu, and Serenade for the Doll was written for her favorite doll. But perhaps the most whimsical and popular piece was Gollywog's Cakewalk, a tune Debussy supposedly heard played by the London Grenadier Guards. In the middle of Gollywog's Cakewalk, Debussy threw in the theme of longing from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, a little joke he undoubtedly enjoyed very much. Debussy wrote the orchestral suite La Mer in 1903 to 1905, when he was in his early 40s. La Mer is a poem in music. It evokes vivid images of a turbulent sea, winds and waves, and dancing sunlight. La Mer, which was inspired by seascapes of the English painter J.M.W. Turner and by the paintings of Claude Monet, is considered Debussy's masterpiece. In the 25 years of his career, Debussy was always breaking old rules and new ground. The whole point of composing, he said, was to explore. His alter ego personality, Monsieur Crush, once said, "I am less interested in what I possess than in what I shall need tomorrow." Debussy challenged traditional methods of harmony, the standard way orchestral instruments were used, and even invented his own 21-note scale. With his innovation and daring, and with the sound of his music itself, Debussy perfectly captured the spirit of his time. The arts and French culture had reached a zenith by the beginning of the 1900s, and Debussy came along just in time to musically reflect it, before it turned in a different direction. That new direction would be influenced by his work, which paved the way for the future by first perfectly expressing the now.